I'm Lauren Hayes, 36 years old, and despite running the lifeblood of my family's mill, I've spent a decade being called just the hands. The night the truth began to surface, the air in our headquarters smelled like polished wood and something colder. I paused outside my father's office, the hum of the mill, a soft thunder through the floor. A stack of production schedules dug into my arm where I held them too tight. I told myself I was only there to drop reports and leave. Instead, my feet stayed planted on that carpet runner like roots in dry ground. Laughter rolled under the doorlight, and careless not meant for me. I didn't know it yet, but a promise my grandfather made years ago was about to meet a wall built by my own family. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and tap that like and subscribe if you've ever had to earn respect twice for the same work. I wasn't raised in a boardroom. I was raised under fear and cedar, trailing my grandfather Walter down logging roads before dawn with a thermos of coffee warming my hands and his stories warming everything else. He taught me to read the grain like a map and to measure time in seasons, not quarters, to harvest only what the land could give and to leave each stand stronger than we found it. I learned that the line between craftsmanship and stewardship is thin, and if you cross it in the wrong direction, you don't just lose quality, you lose your soul. He wasn't blind to profit, but he wouldn't let profit blind him, and he expected the same of anyone who carried our name. My parents valued the company's Shine press releases ribbon cuttings the way a balance sheet plays in a banker's hands, and my sister Brooke learned that language early, crisp, and confident. When I turned 25, I came home with an engineering degree and took the job. Nobody fought for the long shifts on the floor where the sawdust coats your hair and the machines test your patience. In those first years, I stood at the head rig until I could hear a blade drift before I saw it, and I learned our kiln's moods like a neighbor's. Sam Ortega could grade lumber by touch and sound. He taught me respect for the material, and I repaid him by never pretending I knew what I didn't. The crew didn't need speeches. They needed somebody who would show up at 5 a.m., fix the jam, and take the blame if a change went wrong. I became that person, and it fit me the way good boots fit after miles snug, honest earned. Upstairs was another country. The offices gleamed, the conference table stretched long as a river, and conversations floated in a vocabulary that never smelled like pine. My father Richard kept everything in straight lines, spreadsheets, cufflinks, expectations. He introduced Brooke as the future of Hayden Timber and Millworks, while introducing me as the one who kept the gears turning, a compliment that landed like a pat on the head. My mother Evelyn did her best to smooth edges at home, talking about image and growth, as if those words could feed a family. She'd press a hand to my arm and ask if I'd considered more strategic work, meaning a desk, meaning quiet. The gap between our worlds wasn't just money or taste, it was language, the way we named value. I called it yield safety retention. They called it vision. Still, the company's heartbeat ran through the mill, and that was mine to listen to. I mapped bottlenecks, rebuilt maintenance schedules, replaced guesswork with measurements. We cut waste, saved time, and kept people safer. When Brooke floated in with fresh terms from a seminar, I translated them into what our crew could actually do before the whistle blew. It made sense to me that results would speak for themselves, that the numbers would carry farther than any title on a door. Granddad believed that, and he said he'd made sure the company would remember it too, even if people forgot. The older I got, the more I understood how easy it is for quiet work to be crowded out by noise. I'd come home late with the smell of the day clinging to my clothes and place another certificate in a drawer, a safety streak, an uptime mark no one upstairs asked about. Family dinners turned into updates on Brooke's meetings and travel, and when the conversation drifted toward my side of the house, it was usually to ask if I had considered delegating the messy parts. I didn't mind being unseen if the work stayed honest. That was the bargain I believed I'd made, and for a long time it felt like enough. But bargains shift in the dark when you're not in the room, and I had started to notice the shadows. What kept me steady was simple people and timber. Cody the foreman with the pencil behind his ear, and a story for every breakdown we'd already learned how to prevent. Sam, who caught my eye across the line when moisture content ran hot and didn't need a word to adjust. The men and women who showed up in steel-toed boots, who trusted the person who stood beside them more than anyone who waved from a window. I thought about them when I made changes, and I thought about my grandfather when I had to push back. His voice still walked with me from the yard to the office door, reminding me that wood remembers the hands that shape it. That night outside my father's office, the reports pressed against my ribs, and I told myself I'd slide them under the door and keep moving. Voices carried through the crack, confident smooth, the kind that fill a quarterly call and never stumble. A chair scraped glass clinked, and someone laughed in a way that made the hallway feel smaller. I shifted my grip on the folders, reached for the handle and paused, listening, not yet ready to hear my name and what might come after it. The hallway outside my father's office felt too narrow to hold the words spilling through the door. His voice carried the same steady confidence he used at shareholder meetings, polished and absolute. "Transfer 25% to Brooke," he said, the scrape of a chair following. "Let's have this finalized before Lauren's birthday." I stayed still, the folders heavy in my hands. I could hear our attorney's voice, measured, cautious, asking about the will. My father answered before he finished the question. "It's airtight. Walter's clause was conditional, and we've made sure she didn't meet those metrics." My chest tightened. The air smelled like varnish and cedar polish, but I could barely breathe. "She's a worker, not an executive," he added, each word clipped and final. My grandfather's promise echoed faintly in my mind, 30% of the company when I turned 35, if I met his operational goals. I had exceeded them years ago. The attorney's pen scratched against paper, and I took a step back before I could hear anything else. The carpet muffled my footsteps as I turned down the stairs toward the mill floor, each step feeling longer than the one before it. The hum of machinery greeted me, steady and familiar. The bandsaw roared through a fresh log, sending ribbons of wood curling through the air. The smell of pine oil and warm metal wrapped around me like something that had once felt safe. Miguel, our senior grader, lifted his hand in greeting, but I could only nod. The world upstairs had changed something in me. Every gear's spin and every blade's bite sounded different now, like a rhythm I no longer trusted. I crossed to my small office tucked beside the kiln room. Its window overlooked the main line, and for a moment I watched the crew move in practiced sync. They knew this place the way other people knew cities, by sound, by feel, by the way dust settled on the light. The ache in my chest wasn't just anger. It was grief for the illusion that work alone could protect me. When my shift ended, I drove home with the windows down, trying to clear the noise from my head. My apartment sat across town, a narrow one-bedroom filled with second-hand furniture and the faint smell of cedar that clung to my clothes. I pulled a worn wooden box from under the bed, a box my grandfather had given me before he passed. Inside lay a sealed envelope with my name written in his precise handwriting. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. The will's language was formal, but the meaning was clear. Upon reaching 35 years of age, if I had maintained operational efficiency above industry standards for 3 consecutive years, I was to receive 30% voting shares of Hayden Timber and Millworks. The date circled in my mind, 6 weeks away. The proof was there, black ink on ivory paper, but so was the weight of 10 years spent believing merit would be enough. I thought of all the nights I stayed late recalibrating machines, the mornings I arrived before sunrise to cover a shift when someone called out. I thought of Brooke flying to conferences paid for by the company, coming home with glossy reports and new vocabulary that never touched the ground. I thought of my father's praise for her leadership potential while my improvements filled his quarterly reports under someone else's name. The anger that followed wasn't loud. It was quiet, sharp, steady, a saw blade cutting true. I picked up my phone and scrolled through contacts until I found a number I hadn't called in years. The attorney's voicemail was calm and professional. I left my name and asked for a meeting. Then I sat back, heart pounding, staring at the ceiling until dawn. The next night found me alone in the operations office, the building dark except for the lamp on my desk. I opened old performance logs, comparing my data to published reports. Each page confirmed what I already knew. My achievements had been reassigned. My name stripped from every credit. Efficiency gains, waste reduction, safety milestones, all recorded under Brooke's leadership. I took screenshots, copied files, and saved them to a drive. One by one, the lies built into a pattern that no one could dismiss. Around 3 in the morning, I stopped long enough to rub my eyes. The hum of the overnight fans filled the silence. I'd given 10 years to this company, believing that work and integrity could speak for themselves, but silence had cost me everything my grandfather intended me to have. Morning arrived pale and cold. I moved through the floor inspection on autopilot, checking gauges, noting adjustments, nodding at questions I barely heard. When my phone buzzed with a meeting reminder, I followed the stairs up to the glass conference room. My father stood with 2 advisors and our finance director pointing at charts on the screen. The words restructuring and expansion filled the space between them. "Lauren," he said when he noticed me tone-clipped, "we're discussing future plans, nothing for you to worry about." His dismissal was as practiced as his smile. I nodded once and left the sound of their voices fading behind me. That afternoon Brooke called. "Lunch tomorrow." Her tone was light, too cheerful. I almost said no, but something in me wanted to hear what she'd say when she thought I didn't know. The next day, I met her at a riverside bistro, one of those places with white tablecloths and wine lists longer than the menu. She arrived 20 minutes late, sunglasses in her hair, perfume sweet and expensive. "Lauren," she said, brushing an air kiss near my cheek. "You smell like the mill." I folded my napkin neatly. "That tends to happen when you work there." Brooke laughed and signaled the waiter. "I'm just teasing. Daddy asked me to get more involved with operations. You know, before the transition." "What transition?" I asked. She blinked, surprised. "Don't play dumb. Daddy always said I'd run the company someday. You've done such a great job keeping the floor running, but this is business." She smiled like it was a kindness. I leaned forward. "Granddad's will gives me 30% of the company when I turn 35. Her laugh rang sharp enough to draw stares from a nearby table. That was conditional, sweetheart. Leadership metrics. You've never held an executive title. The board won't back you. She patted my hand as if soothing a child. It's better this way. The room tilted slightly. I stood before she finished her wine. "We'll see," I said, and walked out. Back at the mill, I found myself dialing another number, Dana Mercer's. She'd been our safety manager for 8 years before my father fired her for inconsistencies. I'd believed him then. Now I wasn't so sure. She answered on the second ring, her voice wary. "Dana, it's Lauren Hayes." A pause. "Didn't expect to hear from you again." "I need to talk," I said. "About what happened?" "Yes." She was quiet a long moment before saying, 4 o'clock. "The roasting company on Main." Then she hung up. When I walked into the cafe later that day, Dana was already there, her hair threaded with silver, her expression guarded. I slid into the booth across from her. "They're taking the company," I said. Her laugh held no amusement. "Welcome to the club." She stirred her coffee slowly. "They made you take the blame for their shortcuts too, didn't they?" I hesitated, then nodded. "I think they've been hiding more than that." She reached into her bag and placed a small flash drive on the table. "When they fired me, I kept copies. Every safety violation your father ordered me to ignore. Every report Brooke reworded. OSHA, EPA, labor law, you name it." "Why didn't you report them?" I asked quietly. "Your grandfather built that company on integrity. I couldn't destroy what he stood for." She met my eyes. "But Harold and Brooke, I owe them nothing." I closed my fingers around the drive. It felt heavier than it should. "Would you help me? I've been waiting 3 years for you to ask that question." Outside, the late afternoon light cut through the clouds, throwing long shadows across the street. I walked to my truck with the flash drive in my pocket and something new in my chest. Not hope exactly, but motion. That night, I cleared my dining table and began sorting everything I had: the will, the reports, the copied files, and now Dana's evidence. Each piece fit together like a map my grandfather had drawn before he left. By the time the clock reached midnight, the shape of my next move was clear. I wasn't just fighting for an inheritance. I was fighting for the truth of what he built. Tomorrow would bring the first call to an attorney who understood more than numbers. But for now, I watched the light shift across the wood grain of my table, and I knew the silence in our family was finally breaking. The next morning came with a dull, restless light that barely reached my apartment window. The flash drive from Dana sat on the kitchen table beside my cold coffee. I turned it over in my hand again and again before plugging it into my laptop. Rows of documents filled the screen. Inspection reports, memos, digital copies of signatures that didn't match. Each file told a story I didn't want to believe. Safety numbers changed after incidents, disposal logs, rewritten to meet environmental standards, fines paid under company adjustments. My father's initials appeared more often than I could count, and Brooke's name wasn't far behind. I read until my vision blurred, scrolling through years of falsified data, then sat back in my chair staring at the wall. The evidence was heavy, but the silence that followed was heavier. I printed the most damning records and placed them into neat stacks, safety, environmental, payroll. The smell of ink filled the room as the printer hummed steady and relentless, like the mill itself. By mid-morning, I was back at the plant. The hum of the saws met me before I even reached the door, a rhythm I usually found comforting. That day, it sounded like pressure. Miguel waved me over from the sorting line holding a clipboard. "We've got moisture problems again," he said. "The readings are off." I followed him, stepping over sawdust piles, noting the uneven cuts on the fresh batch. I adjusted the settings manually until the blade's sound evened out. The men watched quietly, waiting. When the jam cleared, Miguel gave me a small nod. "You always find it," he said. His trust reminded me of my grandfather's lessons about stewardship, about doing the right thing even when no one's watching. But those words felt far away now, buried under what I'd discovered. That afternoon, a company newsletter landed on my desk, glossy and perfect. Across the front page was a photo of Brooke shaking hands with a major client. The headline called her the new face of Hayden Timber's future. Not a word about the people who ran the floor, not a line about the efficiency milestones that had earned those contracts. I folded the paper in half and placed it in a drawer already full of similar reminders. My phone buzzed soon after a text from our sales director. "Your father and Brooke just left with the Westridge account. Harold introduced her as the future of the company." I read it twice before setting the phone down. The Westridge contract was mine. I'd spent months preparing documentation for their sustainability audits. I had missed birthdays, weekends, sleep. And now she'd walked in and taken the handshake photo. When the mill whistle blew for the shift change, I walked out to the loading area, where the sun caught the floating dust and turned it gold. Sam was tightening a chain on a bundle of planks. "You all right, boss?" he asked quietly. I nodded, though my throat felt tight. "You keep things running smooth. Don't let them tell you otherwise," he said, clapping my shoulder. That night, I sat in the quiet of my apartment, surrounded by printed evidence. I tried to eat, but couldn't taste anything. I thought about how many times I'd chosen to believe my parents' explanations, how many chances I'd given them to see me as more than a pair of hands. The truth was there all along, written in how they looked through me at meetings and the way Brooke's mistakes became team learning experiences, while mine became lessons in humility. The next day was worse. Another inspection issue, another directive from my father that didn't make sense. He'd approved a cut schedule that violated our own safety protocols. I ignored it, choosing the safer procedure instead. I documented everything, every correction, every conflict, because now I knew it mattered. That evening, my parents invited me to dinner. The house smelled like pot roast and lemon polish, just like it always had. My mother smiled too brightly when she opened the door. "You look tired, honey." "Long week," she said, guiding me in. Brooke was already at the table, a glass of wine in hand. My father joined us, adjusting his cufflinks. "We're proud of how things are shaping up," he said, slicing into his meal. "Brooke's been learning quickly." My mother nodded. "She has such natural leadership instincts, doesn't she?" I set my fork down carefully. "You mean she's learning how to take credit?" The words came out quieter than I intended. Brooke blinked, surprised, then laughed lightly. "Lauren, you're being dramatic. What exactly has she led?" I asked. "Does she know what to do when a kiln sensor fails at 2 a.m, or when the moisture index spikes mid-load? How would she manage the line then?" My father cleared his throat. "This isn't a board meeting." "No," I said. "It's the future of the company." The silence that followed was so sharp it seemed to hum. My mother finally set her napkin down and said softly, "Let's not ruin a nice dinner." I didn't answer. I finished my meal quietly, thanked her, and left before dessert. The next day, I met Dana again at her cabin outside of town. The place sat at the edge of a stand of old oak and pine, its porch lined with potted herbs. She had boxes waiting on the table when I walked in. I kept everything she said, every report I was told to change, every test we failed, and pretended we passed. She spread the files out, the paper yellowed at the edges. Your father used to fix just enough to pass an audit. Then he'd revert to the same practices. I traced a finger along the timeline she'd drawn across the top of one page: violations, fines, cover-ups. He taught me this was a legacy, I said quietly. Dana met my eyes. Walter taught you that. Your father just learned how to spin it. Her words sat heavy between us. I thought of my grandfather's calloused hands, his way of pausing before cutting a tree, the way he'd say, "We take only what can regrow." He'd built this place on patience. My father had built shortcuts. Dana pushed another folder toward me. You can still fix this, or you can start over somewhere else. I looked at her. Start over. She smiled faintly. I've got 5 acres here. We could set up a portable mill, a small kiln, make custom pieces. Sustainable wood, no lies. Lawson and Hayes, or Hayes and Mercer. Your choice. I hesitated, imagining the quiet of this place, the freedom of building something honest. I can't walk away yet, I said finally. Not until I know who the company really belongs to. Then let's make sure you have proof, Dana said. By the time I left her cabin, the sky had turned violet. The road home cut through the woods, the trees tall and shadowed on both sides. Their stillness reminded me of the line my grandfather used to repeat whenever storms bent the canopy. The strongest trees don't fight the wind, they hold their ground. I drove the rest of the way in silence, thinking of everything that had been taken and everything I was beginning to take back. The next move would have to be careful, but for the first time, I felt steady. The pieces were finally in my hands, and soon I'd have the courage to use them. The morning after my meeting with Dana, I sat in my truck outside the mill, the fog still clinging to the valley. The sun hadn't yet reached over the ridge, and the lot was empty except for my pickup and the sound of the river in the distance. I opened the passenger door and pulled out the box of files Dana had given me. The papers were yellowed edges soft from age, but the evidence inside was sharper than anything I'd held before. I carried the box into my office, locking the door behind me. On the desk, I spread everything out: safety violations, environmental reports, payroll records, and false signatures that lined up too neatly to be coincidence. Each page was another piece of proof that my grandfather's legacy had been twisted into something else. The name Walter Hayes appeared at the top of many old documents, firm and clear, while the more recent ones bore my father's name in a neat mechanical scrawl. I could almost feel the shift in tone between them. One spoke of stewardship, the other of numbers. By late morning, I called the attorney I'd left a message for days earlier. Daniel Rhodes answered on the third ring. His voice was steady, professional, but not cold. I explained the situation as clearly as I could about the will, the operational benchmarks, the evidence I'd found. He asked for copies of my performance reports and the efficiency data from the last 3 years. When I brought them by his office that afternoon, he studied the spreadsheets carefully. You've exceeded every metric your grandfather set, he said after a few minutes. Operational leadership was the standard, not a title. You've met it. Those words felt heavier than I expected, as if they settled something inside me that had been shifting for years. My father says I haven't met the leadership criteria, I told him. Daniel shook his head. He's misinterpreting the will, or choosing to. He closed the folder and met my eyes. Those shares are yours, Ms. Hayes. The drive home was quiet. I took the long way through the forest road, the one my grandfather used to drive when he wanted to check the tree lines. The air smelled of rain and pine sap, familiar and grounding. When I reached the old stand of Douglas firs he had protected from harvest, I parked and stepped out. The trunks rose around me like pillars, centuries of life stacked in rings I could only imagine. I placed my hand against one of them and thought of what he used to say. We don't own these trees, Lauren. We borrow them for our time here. The wind moved gently through the canopy, and for the first time in weeks, my breathing slowed. I realized I'd been fighting so long to be seen that I'd forgotten why I started working in the mill at all. This place, the land, the people, the craft, it was more than a business. It was a responsibility. And somewhere along the way, my family had traded that for control. When I got home that evening, I opened a box I hadn't touched since my grandfather's funeral. Inside were photos, an old pipe, and a folded flannel shirt that still smelled faintly of cedar. At the very bottom was a leather journal I'd never noticed before. The first page bore his handwriting, the same neat script that had once labeled every field notebook he owned. I turned the pages slowly, each one filled with notes about the business, about his concerns over my father's shortcuts, his disappointment in Brooke's disinterest, and his cautious hope that I might carry on what he started. Near the end, I found an entry dated just weeks before he passed. Lauren has the patience this work requires. She knows how to listen to people and to the land. If she finds her courage, the company will find its way back to truth. I sat for a long time, the journal open across my knees. He hadn't just trusted me with numbers or responsibilities. He'd trusted me with the values that built everything we had. The next morning, I woke before dawn and drove to the mill. The parking lot was still empty, but the first faint light had begun to touch the treetops. I unlocked my office and began sorting through everything again, this time with purpose. I color-coded each set of documents: red for safety, blue for labor, green for environmental. Each stack told its own story, and together they formed a clear picture of neglect and deception. I photographed everything labeled digital files and backed them up on a new drive. Around mid-morning, a text came from Dana. "Got the final inspection logs. Meet at 4. I replied immediately. "I'll bring the contract comparisons." At 4 o'clock, I drove out to her property again. The late light filtered through the pines, turning the air gold. Inside, Dana had spread more files across the table. "I went through the last 3 years," she said. "Your father's been using the same loopholes, fixing just enough to pass, then cutting corners again." She pointed at a set of readings. "These effluent levels. They're 300% over the permitted limit." I looked at the numbers, then at her. "If this ever comes out, the fines alone could cripple the company." Dana nodded. "That's why we need to decide what comes next. You've got enough to expose them." I hesitated, tracing the edge of one folder. "I don't want to destroy what my grandfather built." Dana leaned back. "Then make them answer for what they've done. There's a difference between destruction and accountability." The two of us sat there in the soft light of her kitchen, surrounded by stacks of paper that could change everything. She reached across the table, her expression softer now. "There's another way," she said. "I've got space out back for a portable sawmill and a small kiln. We could start something new. Hayes and Mercer Woodworks. Real craftsmanship, sustainable lumber, no lies." The idea hung in the air like the scent of resin after a fresh cut. For a moment, I could almost see it, our own workshop, the smell of wood and varnish, the quiet hum of honest work. But the thought of leaving the mill, of walking away from everything my grandfather had fought to preserve, felt too much like surrender. "Not yet," I said finally. "I need to finish what he started." Dana nodded, her eyes steady. "Then finish it. And when you're ready, you'll still have somewhere to land." That night I sat on my porch with the journal open beside me and the flash drive glowing faintly in my laptop. I reread the final line of his handwriting. "She must learn to stand tall against the wind." The words felt like a promise and a challenge. The company might still carry my family's name, but I understood now that legacy isn't about inheritance. It's about integrity. Tomorrow I would call Daniel again. We would start the legal process, the filings, the verification of data. There was no turning back now. I gathered the papers into a single stack, placed the journal on top, and whispered softly into the quiet, "I'm ready, Grandpa." The trees outside rustled as if in reply, and the night air carried the faint scent of pine through the open window. For the first time in years, I felt the ground beneath me steady and sure. The storm was coming, but I knew which way I'd stand when it hit. The next 2 weeks felt like a quiet storm gathering behind every ordinary sound of the mill. I still arrived before sunrise, my truck tires crunching across the gravel lot, headlights slicing through the fog that rolled down from the ridge. I'd been collecting proof for days now, files, statements, inspection reports, and locking them in a fireproof box behind my desk. Each document carried a small piece of truth my father had buried, and together they were starting to look like a map leading back to everything he'd tried to erase. That morning I caught sight of Miguel checking the saw feed. He waved me over, holding a clipboard. "New cutting instructions came through last night," he said. "They don't match our inventory." I scanned the orders. The dimensions were off completely wrong for the timber we had curing in the kiln. "Ignore these," I said quietly. "Stick with the plan from yesterday, and if anyone asks, document the change." Miguel nodded once the kind of wordless understanding built on years of trust. By mid-morning, I was at my desk reviewing last quarter's production reports when the sound of heels echoed through the open doorway. My father entered first, Brooke a few steps behind him in a crisp white suit that looked out of place among the sawdust and noise. "Lauren," he said, his tone clipped, "we'll be transferring operational oversight for the Westlake account to Brooke." The room seemed to still. Workers nearby slowed their pace just enough to listen. "The Westlake contract requires custom cuts," I said evenly. "The specifications are already programmed into the system." Brooke crossed her arms, smiling faintly. "I've been briefed," she said. "Dad thinks it's time I handle more client-facing work." Before I could reply, my phone buzzed on the desk. The name on the screen stopped me cold. "Jim Westlake. This is Lauren," I answered, keeping my voice steady. His tone on the other end was friendly but firm. "There's been some confusion," he said. "Someone from your office called about revising our parameters. I just wanted to make sure you're still our point of contact. We only want to work with you, Lauren. Your knowledge of our specs is why we signed with Hayden." The silence after that stretched long enough for my father to hear every word. "I understand completely," I said. "I'll oversee the entire order personally, as always." When the call ended, I set the phone down and met my father's eyes. "Sounds like the client prefers the current arrangement," I said quietly. He didn't answer. Brooke's smile faltered and she turned away. That small exchange traveled faster than any memo ever could. By the afternoon, word had spread across the floor that Westlake had asked for me by name. I didn't mention it, but the change in the air was tangible. Workers who'd kept their heads down before now looked me in the eye, nodding in silent approval. It wasn't celebration, just acknowledgement. A shift in gravity. That evening my mother called to invite me to dinner. "Just family," she said, her tone light, like it had been rehearsed. I almost declined, but something told me to go. When I arrived, the house smelled of rosemary and pot roast, the same meal she made whenever she wanted peace at the table. The dining room gleamed with china we hadn't used since Christmas. My father sat at the head, Brooke beside him, her engagement ring catching the chandelier light. "We have an announcement," my mother said as she poured wine into crystal glasses. "Brooke will be taking an expanded leadership role at the company. The board approved it this morning." Brooke's smile returned, polished and camera-ready. "I'll be overseeing client relationships and financial operations starting next month." I sliced into my dinner carefully. "Quite an achievement," I said, "for someone who's never graded timber." My mother's smile tightened. "Some people are gifted in different ways, dear. You've always been more hands-on. 10 years of 60-hour weeks keeping production at record efficiency," I said softly. "That seems fairly ambitious to me." My father cleared his throat. "Your work has been valuable, Lauren, but Brooke brings professional management experience that the bank finds reassuring." I looked up. First National, I spoke with their loan officer today. He had questions about the leadership change during renewal. The room went still. My mother's fork paused mid-air. Brooke's expression froze, eyes wide. "Why would they call you?" she asked. "Because I'm the signatory on our operational compliance reports," I said, setting my napkin down. Granddad insisted on it before he passed. No one spoke after that. I thanked my mother for dinner and left the weight of their silence following me out the door. Later that night, I met Dana at our workshop space, a converted barn behind her cabin. The place smelled of pine resin and new beginnings. She'd organized the evidence into neat stacks on a long table. "Here's the full timeline," she said. "Safety violations, falsified readings, labor discrepancies. 3 board members were close to your grandfather. Once they see this, they'll have no choice but to act." I ran my hand along a half-finished rocking chair beside us, the wood smooth beneath my fingertips. "Dad and Brooke argued tonight," I said quietly. "She's panicking about taking over operations she doesn't understand." Dana smiled faintly. "They've started realizing how badly they underestimated you." Outside, the night was still. I stood on the porch and looked toward the dark outline of the forest. For the first time in years, the path ahead didn't feel like a fight I was doomed to lose. It felt like a climb steep but solid underfoot. The next morning I arrived at the mill early again. The hum of machinery filled the air as the first shift began. Sam passed me near the kiln room, his eyes bright. "Heard about Westlake," he said. "Word's spreading. Folks are glad you're steering things." I smiled and nodded. Later that day, a message came through from Daniel. He'd scheduled a meeting with one of the senior board members, Thomas Greer, my grandfather's oldest friend. "He's willing to review your grandfather's stipulations in person," Daniel said. "Bring everything you've gathered." That night, I sorted the documents again, each page crisp under the lamp's light. The folders, red, blue, green, were stacked in order. Every violation, every forged signature, every missing safety log. Each was a piece of the company I'd built and the truth they'd tried to bury. When I finished, I turned off the lamp and leaned back in the chair, watching the last glow of light fade from the window. Tomorrow would start the next chapter, one that couldn't be ignored or brushed aside. My father and Brooke had their announcement. I had proof. And this time, the board would hear my side of the story. The night outside was quiet, except for the low hum of crickets and the whisper of wind through the trees. I closed my eyes and thought of my grandfather's words again. Stand tall against the wind. Tomorrow I intended to do exactly that. The morning of my meeting with Thomas Greer arrived gray and damp, the kind of weather that made the air smell like rain even before it started. I'd barely slept. My kitchen table was still covered with files, each one labeled and color-coded, the same order Dana and I had built together. When I reached the office, the mill was already alive, saws whining, forklifts moving stacks of rough-cut lumber, but it all sounded distant like noise underwater. I parked near the loading bay and sat for a moment watching workers move through the morning fog. This was my world, the one my family called small, and the one that had taught me more about integrity than any meeting upstairs ever had. By 8 o'clock, I was standing in the lobby of the Hayes Building, downtown, portfolio in hand. Thomas Greer was already waiting in the conference room. He'd aged since I'd last seen him, thinner, slower, but his eyes were still sharp. "Lauren," he said, shaking my hand firmly, "you look so much like Walter, it hurts." We sat across from each other at the long table, sunlight cutting through the blinds. I opened the folder and began laying out documents, the will, the performance reports, the operational metrics. "My father plans to transfer 25% of the shares to Brooke before my birthday," I said quietly. "But according to this, I've met every requirement of my grandfather's conditions for ownership." Thomas read the top pages slowly, occasionally glancing at me over the rims of his glasses. "These numbers are solid," he murmured. "Operational efficiency, safety, sustainability, all of it exceeds industry standards. I remember Walter saying, 'You'd be the one to carry the company forward.'" He leaned back, exhaling. "Richard's never been patient with process. He likes control. This won't sit well with him." "I'm not trying to take more than what's mine," I said. "I just want the company to reflect what my grandfather built it to be." Thomas nodded and tapped the folder. "Let me talk to a few board members. They'll want to see this for themselves." When I left the meeting, the rain had started a steady, quiet drizzle that blurred the streetlights. I called Daniel from the parking lot. "He's with us," I said. "That's good," Daniel replied. "We'll need that kind of voice when things get loud." Back at the mill, the day unfolded like any other. I walked the floor, checking the new kiln readings, signing invoices, answering questions. Yet everything felt different. The workers could sense it too. The subtle shift in how I carried myself, the quiet certainty I hadn't felt in years. Sam caught my eye as he adjusted the saw feed and gave me a nod. I didn't need words to know what he meant. That evening, I went over the last pieces of evidence in my apartment. The rain tapped softly on the windows as I reread my grandfather's journal one more time. Every line felt like it had been written for this exact moment, a warning and a blessing rolled into one. If she finds her courage, the company will find its way back to truth. The next day began with a call from Dana. "They're planning something," she said. "Brooke's been ordering internal audits, only the kind that justify removing operational oversight. She's setting up for another transfer." "Let her," I said. "I'll be ready." I spent the rest of the day finalizing the timeline for Daniel and Thomas. When I got home that night, a voicemail from my mother waited on the phone. "Dinner tomorrow," she said sweetly. Your father wants to discuss the future. Please don't make it difficult. Dinner was never just dinner with them. The next evening, I arrived at the house to find the good china out again, candles burning low on the table. Brooke was already there scrolling through something on her tablet. My father stood at the bar pouring a drink. Glad you could make it, he said. We sat down, and before the plates were even passed, my mother started. Your father and sister have been working very hard on this transition, she said. It's time for the company to embrace a more modern approach. Brooke smiled faintly. That includes streamlining operations, automating where possible. We'll be bringing in new leadership to oversee production. I looked from one to the other. So this is the part where you ask me to step aside. Not ask, my father said. We're offering you a chance to consult. Less responsibility, less stress. The words stung more than I expected, but I kept my voice calm. You're trying to make it easier to replace me. He didn't deny it. The board agrees we need a different direction. I set down my fork. Funny, Thomas Greer didn't seem to think so when I spoke with him yesterday. The room went silent. My mother's smile froze. Brooke's eyes widened, and my father's hand tightened around his glass. You went to the board, he asked, voice low. I went to someone who still believes in what Grandpa built, I said, and he believes I've earned my share of it. My father pushed back from the table. You're making a mistake, Lauren. Maybe I said standing, but this time it's mine to make. I walked out before they could say anything else. The night air hit me like a cleansing wave, cool and sharp. My hands trembled as I unlocked my truck, but not from fear, from release. The following morning I arrived at the mill before anyone else. The fog hung low over the yard, thick enough to swallow sound. I unlocked the office, turned on the desk lamp, and spread the documents across the table once more. The air smelled faintly of oil and damp pine. Everything I'd worked for, every late night, every sacrifice led to this moment. By the time the first workers arrived, I was already deep in notes for the upcoming board review. Dana called to confirm she'd sent the last set of inspection reports. Everything's in order, she said. If they try to push the transfer, you'll have proof ready. Thank you, I told her, for not giving up on this place. The mill came alive again around me, the rhythm of saws and conveyors mixing with the steady beat of my own pulse. I glanced toward the floor where Sam and Cody were working. They didn't know exactly what was about to happen, but they knew enough to stand behind me. That night, I met Daniel in his office. He went over the final details of the presentation for the board. You've got them cornered, he said. Once you show the performance metrics and the evidence of falsified records, they'll have no grounds to deny your claim. I nodded, closing the folder. Then we move forward. He leaned back, studying me for a moment. You remind me of your grandfather, he said. He fought with quiet strength, never had to raise his voice to be heard. As I drove home, the city lights flickered through the rain. I could feel the tension building, the kind that comes before everything breaks open. Tomorrow would start a chain of events no one in my family could control, not even my father. At home, I placed the journal back on the table beside the neatly packed portfolio. The pages were worn now, smudged with fingerprints, but the words remained steady. Stand tall against the wind. I turned off the lamp and stood at the window, watching the reflection of the trees swaying beyond the glass. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but I could feel it coming, the moment when truth would no longer stay quiet. The morning of the board meeting felt heavier than any storm that had passed over the valley. I woke before dawn, the house silent except for the low hum of rain on the roof. My charcoal blazer hung over a chair, pressed and waiting. On the kitchen table sat the leather portfolio that had become my anchor, every document, every signature, every truth I'd gathered to prove what my grandfather intended. I poured a cup of coffee but didn't drink it. My hands were steady, but my heart felt like it had been working overtime for weeks. By the time I reached the Hayden building, the parking lot was already lined with cars. Through the glass doors, I could see my mother in the hallway outside the boardroom, her pearl earrings catching the light. You didn't have to dress up for a family meeting, she said softly when she saw me. This isn't about appearances, Mom, I replied, brushing past her. Inside, the room smelled faintly of leather and fresh polish. My father stood at the head of the long table, a stack of folders beside him. Brooke sat to his right, her confidence shining like the gold in her bracelet. On his left was their attorney, Mark Greenfield, whom I'd met years ago at a company dinner. He nodded politely, though his eyes darted toward my portfolio. My father gestured toward a chair. "Let's get this wrapped up. We've got calls with investors later." I took my seat without answering. The air in the room felt too still, like everyone was waiting for a cue that hadn't come yet. "As you know," my father began, "we're moving forward with a new leadership structure. Brooke will take a controlling share of operations 25%, and you'll retain 5%. That gives you stability while allowing us to expand." My mother smiled faintly as if the decision had already been accepted. Brooke leaned forward, voice soft and measured. "You'll still have a say in day-to-day matters, Lauren. We just need clear lines of authority." I folded my hands on the table, letting their words settle. When I finally spoke, my voice was even. Granddad's will was specific. 30% of voting shares contingent on operational metrics that I've met for 3 consecutive years. You all know that. My father's expression didn't change. Those were subjective conditions. Leadership, not labor. The board will see it that way. I reached into my portfolio and set a sealed envelope in the center of the table. That's my attorney's statement confirming the will's validity and proof that I've met every requirement outlined. Then I slid a second folder forward. "And this is the part you won't want to read but need to." Brooke frowned. "What is this years of falsified safety records, forged environmental compliance reports, and payroll violations?" I said quietly. "All under your oversight, Dad. All signed off by management, not operations." My mother's forked composure wavered. "Lauren, this isn't the place." "It's exactly the place," I interrupted, keeping my tone steady. "Because this meeting is about who holds responsibility. And I won't carry the blame anymore." Mark Greenfield cleared his throat and reached for the documents. His eyes scanned quickly, slowing as he flipped through the pages. "These appear legitimate," he said finally. "OSHA and EPA violations. Some of these carry serious penalties." I placed a flash drive beside the papers. "That contains digital copies of every falsified report, along with employee statements confirming they were ordered to ignore safety issues. I have the originals secured elsewhere." My father's face darkened. "You're threatening your own family," he said quietly. "No," I said. "I'm protecting the company your father built." The room went still. The only sound was the faint patter of rain against the window. Brooke shifted in her seat, her earlier confidence gone. "You can't do this," she said finally. "You'll ruin everything." I met her eyes. "You did that when you tried to take what wasn't yours." Mr. Greenfield looked between us. "Richard, with this level of documentation, she's in full compliance with the will. And these violations, if reported, could expose the company to massive liability. You don't have the leverage to fight her." My mother whispered, "Lauren, please, think of the family's name." I said, standing. "You have 48 hours to reinstate the safety protocols, correct the filings, and honor the will as written. If you don't, these documents go to the authorities and the board." My father's jaw tightened. "You wouldn't destroy your own legacy." I took a deep breath. "I'm not destroying it. I'm saving it." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Thomas Greer cleared his throat from the far end of the table. I hadn't noticed him slip in during the exchange. "She's right," he said. His voice was quiet but firm. Walter would have stood with her. My father turned toward him. "Tom, you don't understand. I understand perfectly," Thomas said, cutting him off. "I watched Walter build this company from nothing. He trusted his granddaughter to protect it when he couldn't. You'd be wise to remember why." The silence that followed felt different, no longer charged, but resolved. I gathered my papers and slid them back into my portfolio. "I'll expect your response by Friday," I said. Then I turned toward the door. As I reached for the handle, Brooke's voice broke through the quiet. "Lauren, wait. What about us?" I looked back at her, the sister I'd once carried through every childhood storm. "You'll be fine," I said softly, "but this time you'll have to earn it." Outside, the rain had slowed to a mist. I walked through the parking lot, the sound of my heels on the pavement steady and deliberate. Behind me, through the glass walls of the conference room, I could still see them sitting in stunned silence, their reflections blurred by the rain. When I reached my truck, I paused and looked up at the sky. The clouds were thinning, a faint sliver of light breaking through. For the first time in years, the weight on my chest lifted. I had done what needed to be done. The storm wasn't over yet, not by a long shot, but the truth was finally out in the open. And the next move for once wasn't mine to make. When I woke the next morning, the sky had cleared completely. The air felt lighter sharp with the scent of wet cedar after the rain. I drove out to the mill before sunrise headlights sweeping across the empty yard. Inside, the hum of the machines began to rise steady and sure, like the rhythm of something finding its balance again. By noon, word of the board's decision had spread through the company. My father had signed the reinstatement documents confirming my rightful 30% of shares and stepping back from day-to-day management. Brooke's new role was temporary advisory, a polite phrase for a retreat. The safety protocols Dana had fought for were already being restored, and the morning meeting began with a notice from the board emphasizing integrity and compliance. It was strange hearing those words echo through the same walls that had ignored them for so long. Later that day, I found my father in his office, staring out the window toward the loading docks. He looked smaller somehow, his confidence worn thin. "It didn't have to come to this," he said quietly. I stood in the doorway, unsure whether he meant the company or us. "No," I said, "but it did. It was never about taking anything from you, Dad. I just wanted what Grandpa promised and what I earned." He nodded, not quite meeting my eyes. There was no apology, but there was something close to understanding, and for now that was enough. Outside, the crew gathered near the main saw line as we shut down early for a safety briefing. Sam stood beside me, wiping his hands on a rag, his expression proud and tired. "Feels different around here," he said. I smiled. It should. It's finally being run the way it was meant to be. Dana arrived a few minutes later holding 2 cups of coffee and a grin that said she'd been waiting years for this day. "Guess I'll have to find another excuse to yell about safety," she joked. That evening, I drove out to my grandfather's old cabin near the ridge. The drive was quiet, the trees dark against the fading sky. Inside, the air still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and sawdust, like he'd only just stepped out for a walk. I built a small fire in the wood stove and sat at his desk with his journal open to the last page. The ink had faded slightly, but his words still held their shape. She must learn to stand tall against the wind. I ran my fingers over the page and whispered, "I did, Grandpa," and they finally heard me. The fire popped softly, and for a moment I could almost feel him there, his hand on my shoulder, that patient smile that had carried me through so many hard mornings. In the months that followed, the company began to look more like the place he'd built decades ago. We restored the apprenticeship program he once started for local students, and I made sure every crew member who'd stayed through the hard years received fair pay and recognition. Brooke moved to Seattle soon after taking a job with a consulting firm. We speak occasionally carefully the way people do when they're still learning how to be family again. My mother visits the mill sometimes now, usually bringing cookies for the crew. It's her way of making peace without saying the words. As for my father, he still owns a share of the business, but spends most of his time at home tending the garden he once ignored. We don't talk about the past much. There's still tension, still silence where warmth used to be, but there's also something that feels like the start of forgiveness. One crisp morning that fall, I walked the forest line behind the mill where the oldest trees still stood untouched. The air was cool and golden sunlight streaming through the canopy. I stopped beside the massive fir my grandfather had called the Sentinel. Its trunk was wider than my truck, its bark deep and scarred each groove, holding decades of weather and time. I rested my palm against it, feeling the quiet strength rooted beneath my hand. It reminded me that endurance isn't loud, it's steady. When I looked back toward the mill, smoke from the chimneys rose in clean ribbons straight and clear against the blue sky. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was carrying the weight of the past. I was part of something alive again, something honest. In the end, justice didn't arrive in a single moment. It came in steps and choices in the slow rebuilding of trust. I learned that standing tall doesn't mean standing alone. It means knowing when to hold your ground and when to let go. I still keep my grandfather's journal on my desk, its leather cover worn smooth from use. Whenever a decision feels too heavy, I run my thumb along the edge of that final page and remember the man who taught me that true legacy isn't measured in profit or power. It's measured in principle. If you've ever had to fight quietly for what's right, I hope my story reminds you that patience and truth can outlast even the strongest storm. And if it did, share it with someone who might need to hear it tonight. Sometimes the smallest act of courage is simply not giving up.